Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Cyber Policy Center's Spring Seminar Series. Today, it's really my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Sandy Pentland, a pioneer figure in computational sciences, policies, and the digital economy. Professor Sandy Pentland is a center fellow at Stanford High. He directs MIT's Human Dynamics Laboratories and MIT Media Lab. He also co-directs the World Economic Forum's Big Data and Personal Data initiatives and is a founding member of the advisory board of Nissan, Motorola, Telefonica, and a lot of startup firms. He has previously helped create and direct MIT's Media Lab and the Media Lab Asian Laboratories at the Indian Institute of Technology, and the strong hospital center for the future health. I believe many people here, both in person and online, academic hero is Professor Sandy. His citation of Google citation is more than 158K citations, and he has more than 158 high index numbers. And besides all those amazing academic achievements, his work really fundamentally changed how we think about technologies and how we can make technology better for the human societies. He is named one of the top 7, the most important, the most powerful, the top 7 most powerful data scientists, along with CEO of Google, Larry Page. And besides all those scientific contributions, his work really shaped how the policies about GDPR and many things we have today worldwide and globally about how we think about sustainabilities and how we can make technology accountable and make human better. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Professor Sandy. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, especially how you'll share your wisdoms about this new thinking about shared wisdom. Thanks.
Of the book up there if you want.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Please welcome.
Thank you. It's always a little embarrassing to have people say, oh, you've done all these things. Well, sure. Okay. So I'm going to talk about human-compatible AI, but not the way that Russell Stewart at Berkeley would talk about it, which has to do with intentions. What I want to do is get down to a finer grain and talk about what are the things you have to preserve about human decision-making and where can AI help. And I'm going to give some examples that I think are probably really relevant to this audience here. At least that's what I hope. I'm sort of new here as a faculty member, so this is a sort of get-to-know-you type of thing. And so I'm going to try and cover a bunch of territory. And what that will inevitably do is produce a little bit of confusion because I'm going fast. But you can always ask questions, and that's what we have at the end. So here's the sort of core thing that I think one wants to think about is that humans are not rational individuals. I'm sorry. I'll show you a couple of examples. There's 2 things that are wrong with that word characterization. One is rational. We know we make mistakes. We do silly things. And the question is can we sort of wean ourselves to just be rational like that? But the other one that's really wrong is individual. We learn from other people constantly. And the sort of Danny Kahneman type stuff is maybe he thinks like 95% of our actions and responses are socially determined rather than individually determined. We live in a culture. We respond to that culture. We duplicate that. We endorse that culture. The law, and since this is a law school, I'll try and be relevant to law. So the law is part of that culture. It's not an individual thing. You don't think it up as you go along. It's a consensus or something like that. So just to convince you of that little statement, if you look at tests of people's ability to do syllogisms, and these are not idiots. These are people, maybe they're not you, but they're like people in college, right? You find that 2/3 of the people make errors in syllogisms and that there are 16 common errors that people make. Now, this is 3 sentences, right? You all know what a syllogism is. There's 2/3 of everybody screws up at that in college. This is not a rational bunch of people. Here's a couple other things that are amusing. 25% of Americans think that the sun goes around the earth. Well, it's only been 500 years, so, maybe eventually we'll get up to like in the high 90s of getting that right. How many people, so Pew Charitable Trust did a big study of how many people think that governments should do more about climate change. Want to have a guess at what the percentage of people worldwide think that governments ought to do more about climate change? Come on, I need one or two guess. Quick. 70. Okay. 85. Why are we talking about climate denial? We ought to talk about what the governments can do, right? I mean, it's like, that's shocking. Okay? I mean, you can go pick nits about it and so forth, but it just shows that we are wrong about lots and lots of things all the time, and yet, the coffee is still warm, we still get home, the car works, somehow we get things going along. What is it that we're doing if it's not the sort of model of logical thinking based on facts, right? Well, I think that what we're doing, and I think the evidence argues, is what we're doing is something that I'll call social foraging. What this is you're going in and you're trying to find things strategies, actions that accomplish your goal. Now, you don't understand exactly how that happens. For instance, how many of you really understand internal combustion engines or what's in your phone? The answer is about nobody, okay? But we use them just fine. We have action strategies that are successful, okay? And we learn from each other. That's called culture. In animal, this is called foraging. So the basic thing is that you learn from what other people do. That's something where we come to some sort of common agreement. That's a culture. We have our personal experience, which modulates that culture, right? And then we take choices. And we tend to explore sometimes about things we don't know, because there's this dilemma. If you just stick with the old stuff, you're never going to do better than you've already done. You need to explore a little bit, right? That's called foraging. You see this very characteristically in bees. You also see it in great apes who do it verbally. They have this thing called hoot pant, which is how they debate things about which way to go. Didn't know that. It's sort of interesting. And of course, people do foraging. We go out and we try different things. Okay? And we have a study that we did. This is from about 250,000 people over 18 months, where we're looking at how they make financial decisions with their own money, about average of $10,000 per person. And it includes some of the leading lights in cognitive science, Josh Tenenbaum, Griffiths, and is in what is probably the leading journal. So you could take this a little bit seriously, right? And what we show was that people's decisions look like this foraging stuff. You take examples from the culture around you, and you use those to condition your own personal experience. And then there's a variety of choices that you rank from that, and you choose the most likely, but sometimes also the second or third most likely. This is called a bandit problem mathematically. It is a provably optimal way of making decisions in uncertain environments. And what it means by optimal is minimum regret. You make the minimum stupid things that you can by following this thing. It is not a logical thing. It is, what are the popular things that other people do? Those are your space of possible actions. And then you take those and you say, well, can I do that? Can I do this one? Has this worked out for me in the past? And then you take action based on it. That's what people do with their money. Okay? And I'll show, and it's what bees do and so forth. It has this wonderful optimality property, which is stronger than most of the deductive things, because it's intended for environments where we don't understand everything, and environments where things are changing. So I would urge you to take it seriously, because this is a pervasive thinking mistake that humans in our current culture make. So, example, polarization. So we all know polarization, big problem, lots of countries. I'm going to call this the Milgram variations. It's like, variations on a theme. So Milgram had an experiment, which probably, hopefully all of you know, where We'll bring some poor schnook in and say, we're going to do an experiment where you shock somebody who's behind the curtain. And the person behind the curtain will go, my heart is going to give out, I'm going to die. But there was a bunch of people in white coats who said, oh, don't worry about it, it's not going to happen. And so subjects would kill the person behind the curtain regularly on the advice of these experts. So that's the experiment you probably know, right? So this is not a logical thing. I mean, think about this for a bit. But what they don't tell you is that there's a variation on this experiment where one person in a white coat said, no, don't do it. So, 5 people say do it, one person says don't. Guess what the humans do, the subjects do? They don't do it anymore. So they have all this facts, right? All these experts saying do it, do it, do it, but they don't feel like this is a good thing, and there's at least one expert that backs them up. That's a social sampling or frequentist way of thinking about things. You couldn't put this in a sort of a deductive framework. So what does that mean for us, okay? So I have that little icon up there. It's how do we sample the culture around us to make our decisions? That's what that little thing means. So here is a polarization thing. So if you ask left-wing people about what the right-wing people believe, they all say, they want like a Hitler, right? Some strong man to do things, okay? Right? If you ask the right wing about that, they have the same answer. And the statistics are almost identical. And this is familiar from other sorts of situations like arms control and nuclear war, where it's in the interest of the influencers and the politicians to scare you, to make you think things are really bad so that you'll take action. Okay? Because if you actually go and you talk to the people without, about what their own beliefs are and what they do, you find out that both the left and the right are very much supporters of democracy. They're not for strong people at all. There is a tail that is, but most of the social media, because they thrive on clicks, characterizes the really radical voices. And it's in the interest of, quote unquote, the establishment to do that, right? Gets them power. So what do you do about this? We all have experience about this. First, this is a paper that we did with Alia Bradley was the lead one, Nature Human Behavior. It's sort of interesting. It's like in 1 year, it's gotten 86 citations, which is a lot in social science. So what we did, just a simple little thing where we spent 5 minutes doing a Q&A. If you're a Republican, you'd say, well, what do Democrats think? Well, what about freezing the social media accounts of Republican journalists, right? And the answer is no, they don't think that. So it's just sort of going through things from, for instance, the Pew Charitable Trust, informing people through this little gamification interface of, roughly 12 things, 12, 15 things, that's it, right? Now, what do you think that will do? Well, the answer is, so this is like Milgram's experiment with one dissenter, okay? If everybody says, oh, no, they're that way, you'll say, well, okay, I guess they're that way, right? But if there's reasonable, even if it's minority dissension, it becomes a possibility for you. And so this is the distribution of attitudes, which is reflected in voting 2 weeks later. After the little treatment, you get this large 30% difference towards Democratic and away from polarized. That is crazy, right? We're going to have like 5 minutes, dozen sort of questions. 2 weeks later, they vote differently. And what's interesting is that Rob Willer here did his mega study, 32,000 people, 25 different interventions for polarization. This was the best performing overall. Right? So you have to try to explain this. This is not just some random social thing that happened to work. And I'm giving you an explanation, which is that we're not rational individuals. What we do is we sample from our culture and make decisions about what we think based on what we sample. If you distort your perception of the culture enough, then we make really poor decisions. And that optimality goes away. Okay? Does that make sense? So, okay, cool. You may think, well, one thing, who cares, right? So here's a couple other things. So do we do these same sorts of things, this foraging behavior in other areas? So let's look at something. So first I want to mention that one of the things that's important in decisions in people is, do the people that you're learning from have the same values and utilities? Okay? If you take this was in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. If you take a team of people that are just randomly selected and you ask them to do a whole variety of estimation tasks and problem solving, they do sort of okay. Teams of like 3 or 4 are optimal there. But if you take those, instead of just random individuals, you take teams where you get to do this repeatedly, right? So you get to know the preferences of the other people in your team, okay? So you can adjust your things based on them. You can do better. But if you take people that have similar values and utilities and you ask them as a team to do it, you get something that is strictly better. It's always better. Even the individual is better than the teams. Okay? So diversity in experience matters, but similarity in values is important for accuracy in decisions. Okay? So this is why we have things like communities of practice. Community of practice are people who have diverse experiences perhaps, but they're interested in a particular thing. Okay, so let's look at something big. So this is recent work. So this is the map of science. So this is a 2-dimensional projection of a large language model, like large deep neural net, embedding of all the citations of all the science papers in the world for the last most of a century. Okay, so you can see over there, you get like chemistry and physics, and over here you get nursing and social work. They don't talk to each other at all. And in the middle you have religion and Asian studies and things like that, and they don't talk to either the social workers or the physicists. We all sort of know this, right? What that means is they're not part of the same community. Okay, but let's take a little community here. Can we predict what people will find interesting and important and cite a lot, okay, in that community? Well, you see, if you look at it, that there's some holes in that community. This is this projection again still. And if you say, well, where could you put a paper that a lot of people would be interested in it and is a sort of empty space? And that's this community model. Here's the people that are doing. It's on archive. It's under review at Science. And if you use that model, now this is not about the content. There's no content here, okay? Works for any part of science or anything that's got a journal, okay, for a long time. It says, that's an interesting area. It turns out that you can compare it to other sort of models of what makes a paper good. So it could be it's a famous person doing it, right? So that's this reputation thing. And you can do pretty well at predicting, over 20 years, this is over 20 years, people from good reputations tend to get cited more. You can look at the beginning of the paper and say, does it take off like Jackrabbit, where it's like really getting lots of citations? And that actually does almost twice as well as reputation. But if you do this community model, it's hugely better. Now, you have to remember, this has no content, 0. It's just the pattern of other papers and citations and saying, hey, here's a place. So we don't know what these papers are about, but now we know where to look. Now, what's interesting for this audience is you can do this with law. So if you take citations in law, you can predict which areas of law are going to have the biggest battles, therefore the most citations. That's pretty good. Now, you can't do it out 20 years with law. If I remember right, law, it's a pretty good prediction out about 5 years, and then it sort of decays a little bit. Okay? So that's on archive. And again, this is not about content. It's not about logic. This is about working with the community around you to find places that will be of interest to lots of people and where maybe you have an opportunity. Okay? So those are some of the things that we did before we came here. This is a sort of more current and edgy bit. And so there's opportunities to be involved. So we created something called Deliberation.io, and these are the people that are involved in it. And one of the versions of it is something that uses little AI summarizers to help people make decisions as a group. So you can look at the site. It does things like this face of the crowd thing where you show people distributions of opinions. It's based on, inspired by Polis, which is a sort of well-known deliberation platform. Comes Colin McGill, who's up in the city, developed that. But what we're trying to do is figure out how you can scientifically validate better platforms for making communal decisions. So this is a test in that. And what it is this is ELIZA 2.0. How many people know what ELIZA is? This is going to disappoint me. Okay, so back in the early 60s, when the dinosaurs were still, somebody made a very simple chatbot called ELIZA, and it was Rogerian. So Roger was a famous psychologist, and his way of doing things was just to say, why do you feel that way? So you'd say something, why do you think that, right? So he would never contribute any content at all. He would just ask for people to reflect on what they were saying. That's Rogerian psychology. So this is sort of like that, but for groups. So we've done both that one, which helps people make better decisions. But I'll show you the one that's a little more sort of AI, which is group Rogerian. That's a little bit like a mediator might do, where they'd say, well, you guys all contribute your opinions, and then the mediator says, well, what I hear you saying is this, and you seem to agree about these things, but not about those things. What do you think? New round of comments. That's just doing, right? Now you can sneak a little bit of bias in there, but it's not as much as you can. It's not really about the content, right? It's about the pattern of comments that people make, just like the science thing. And what you're doing here, so this is, should we allow military use in peaceful protests? What this means in the longer thing is, should we have military guys nearby when there's a protest so that things don't get out of hand? But of course, you could imagine negative versions of that, where there's suppression and so forth. And having a couple of moderation iterations. So where people comment about it, they get to see each other's comments. Then there's an AI summary that says, oh, I see, this is what I hear you saying, but I see disagreement about this other thing. So you find that the AI moderated one is something that people like a lot better than just doing it as humans, and that they would participate better. They like the experience better, right? And you might say, well, okay, but the AI is controlling this. Well, actually, let's look at people who are unpopular opinions, like the people who think military forces should be used at peaceful things. And this process with the AI was more effective at bringing them in towards the middle than just having conversations with other people. And they felt good about it because they felt like their opinions had been heard. Just saying, okay? So this is, again, sort of trying to not say there's logic or facts. It's just trying to manipulate this cultural artifact of people sampling opinions and making personal decisions. And manipulate in this case means accelerate, right? People like the AI moderation better. So we're taking this out. And then let me finish real quick with one other thing that we're doing. is everybody's talking about this agent economy that's coming. So everything's going to be agents. All these companies, the government, everybody's going to have agents. And the natural question is, okay, well, great. Who's going to defend me, right? Do I get an agent? Okay, so what we're doing is we're working with Codex, part of law school, I guess, and Consumer Reports to actually build and test these to see if we can make agents that are fiduciaries for individuals, authenticated fiduciaries who help you make decisions. And what does that mean? Because that's sort of what you'd really like, okay? Again, that's accelerating the whole sort of process of cultural evolution, where you make people more aware of what the opinions are in your culture, and then how you reflect on those, and then you contribute back to let other people know. So the current situation, as you know, is all these companies are trying to attack you and get you to buy stuff, right? And it would be nice to have an agent to sort of like winnow a lot of that out and also control the data that you give back. I had a young person, like teenagers, say, oh, it's like smart cookies. So now your phone or your computer has a little AI that plays with the cookies on your computer so that if you're interested in X, only those sort of cookies are on your computer. If you're not interested in something, there's no cookies for that. That's not actually all it does, but but that gives you a sense, it gives you much more control of how you're visible on the web. And of course, you'd like to have something that can help you find the things that you're interested in and find good versions of it. And it needs to be fiduciary, it needs to actually represent you. And we know simple versions of fiduciary duty in certain simple cases. But the general thing of how you do that is not clear. So it's both a legal question and AI sort of technology question is, how do you make fiduciaries for individuals? So it's a little bit like, the alignment problem for AI, but this is on an individual basis and on a case-by-case basis. So in some senses it's easier, but in other ones it's harder. So big companies want this because they think that it'll end up being cheaper for them, but they worry about liability and reputation, and so what we're going to try and do is create a best practice standard. So they like that because then they don't get sued quite as much, and we like it because they behave themselves a little better. Just to notice, one of the things that the big companies think is this gets rid of the web. People won't make decisions on web pages anymore. Instead, their agent will do things through another sort of side channel. Webs are there to inform you, to entertain you, but it's not something where you make decisions on, right? Except perhaps, under some circumstances. Interesting to sort of think about what are going to be the ramifications of this. And I'll tell you, every big company out there is building these things. So this is coming soon to you, and you want to think about this type of stuff. And then for, the 40th anniversary of Codex? So we're going to be part of a antitrust. Because as you begin to change these sort of who has agency on the web, you change the data economy, and I think that has real ramifications for antitrust. I think it says that antitrust is a little outdated, and you need to look at something they might call data antitrust. Okay? So those are just things you could get involved in. I'll mention again, there's books over there if you're interested in sort of a little more depth on this, and that's it. Okay? I'm supposed to take this over here, right? And you're supposed to ask me questions.
Hey, thanks. Such an amazing talk. I have so many questions, but I want to start with you're thinking about the AI agents here. So what are you most excited about, and what are you most concerned about this new development with AI agent?
Well, there's two things that I'm most concerned about. One is you're going to have all these smart agents trying to persuade you to do things. So that's really, if you look at the model of decision making we have, it says that we're in big trouble, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is in a world with lots of agents, you can have disasters that happen pretty quickly. So for instance, in high frequency trading, you have lots of little agents trying to buy and sell stocks.
Right.
And they cause market crashes almost every day because they sort of get ahead of themselves, that cause liquidity problems, et cetera. But you can't do that in the real world. You can't, I mean, if that happens in the real world, that means medicines don't get places, power doesn't get generated, whatever. So those are two concerns about this upcoming agentic world. And then the one, you know, like who's going to defend me? Who's going to defend you? You need something that's like a digital public infrastructure that actually follows. It's not going to be perfect, but it ought to protect you over most things, scams, poor purchases, things like that. And it ought to make your life a lot simpler in some ways. How can we actually build that? I think we can. So we're going to, and we're going to see.
Right. So that's my next question is, what type of policy framework do you think that will work to regulate those agents? Do you think about it, some work relates to framework relates to AI or some like consumer protection as a product type? So what do you think will
Well, we're working with consumer reports, and the idea there is that there are some areas where we have a pretty good idea of what the ethical framework is and the legal framework, right?
Right.
We know about scams, we know about bad products, things like that. So that means we know a lot about the utility function of the people, right? You know, and so those are places that are clear enough that we can begin trying to experiment with this and see what happens and what are the unintended consequences. So you remember that social networks were touted as being like the solution to everything, you know, back in the year 2000, and now we know they're not. So even if we have something that is a fiduciary that represents you and protects you from many things, there may be unintended consequences. And the way to tell that is to do this in a sandbox where real people really try it out of their own choice, and you have sort of social science to look and see what's happening. You know, what are the unintended consequences?
No, that's amazing. So my next question I have is about your next round about social foraging. I think that's a really brilliant idea, is how we collect all those different type of informations in a way to help us to make these decisions better. So my question, I have two questions. First is, do you think that's how those new AI agents and all those new models will change fundamentally how individuals, communities, and organizations foraging information, and how do we know that, collect evidence for that?
Yeah, so one of the things is when everything is digital like that, it's much easier to collect evidence, right? And so we know that if we deploy these things and we have the wrong model of human behavior and the wrong model of cultural evolution, we're going to get disastrous outcomes. If we can deploy these things in a way that are sufficiently articulated and respectful and capture how people are actually making decisions well enough in terms of their architecture, we ought to get responses where people are making better choices and are happier about it, and the kids grow up and the world's happier. A lot of that has to do with being able to get out of echo chambers, to see the broad range of opinions, of encouraging people to be reflective rather than knee-jerk. That's going to get fought by a lot of people. For instance, all the people that make money off of clicks, right? If you have your own newspaper and you don't have to subscribe to their newspaper, it's going to be a little bit different world, isn't it?
Right,
yeah,
right.
okay. So that's one of the things that excites me about this is that it's a possibility to turn the dynamics of the data economy upside down. Right, where people are much more in charge of it than companies or large organizations. It's not guaranteed that that's going to happen. You can imagine really bad outcomes, but it's possible to have much better outcomes.
Right, that's so interesting. I was talking to one of our Stanford freshmen this morning about screen time control. Her idea is that she's always set up screen time for her phone, but on one hand she feels she has control, but on the other hand she feels that she does not, because she has to rely on that screen time to moderate. So I think that same mechanism for this agent is really that that's when we have even our own agent. Does that is in fact lose control or gain controls? And what's a way to make
So
that?
this is part of what it means to be a fiduciary, right?
Right.
You have to have something that actually represents the interests of the person. So, that's a difficult standard to actually maintain, but an example of something like that, in the example of screen time, is you might have evidence about what's good for people on average and engage in a dialogue when she wants to have more screen time.
Right.
Say, well, on average, this is not so good for people. You sure? And she says, sure. And then you give her more, right? Because it's really her choice about these things until it gets to really extreme versions where it's clear that harm is actually happening, right?
That's brilliant. I have my last question, then I will open up to questions for both online and our audience here. So for the deliberation AIs, I think the results are really amazing, so that AIs fundamentally make people more engaged and better make decisions. So what do you think are the mechanisms there? Why AIs can support those decision-making process and deliberation process?
Well, so if you think about the decision-making process I talked about, so there's this notion of knowing what the culture supports, what has been tried, what were the results. A lot of the things that are wrong today are that we don't have a good view of the whole spectrum of things, right? We are in an echo chamber. But also, we deliberately put ourselves in some echo chambers, right? So there's this term called weird, which is Western, educated, rich, industrialized, democratic. We're a minority in the human population. There are other alternatives for running things that would be good to know about, at least, so that if only to reject them, to sort of open the aperture on what is possible. And I think, so that's one type of thing, is making people more aware of it. Another is making them, encouraging them to be more reflective about these things. So much of what you see on social media or in other sorts of domains is essentially knee-jerk behavior. That's that system one type behavior. And what that is sort of this reflection of what you hear around you. It's not usually what you really believe. So being able to reflect people like that. Another type of thing has to do with the notion of community and identity, and trying to sort of figure out identity and community are absolutely critical. They've been undermined by a lot of this technology. But at the same time, there are negative aspects about it where those ideas have been manipulated in ways that cause, for instance, echo chambers and bad things. So figuring that out is going to be a pretty interesting thing. So what I'm suggesting here is that AI should be used to support essentially the contextual awareness of people, but not replace the decision making. Right? So this is you can sort of think of it as an active librarian, right? Active librarian who recommends things to you, makes you sort of aware of what's going on, but doesn't tell you what to think. Right?
That's right. Amazing. So let's open to questions from both online and our Zoom and people here.
First, Sandy, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I loved all the work that you've done and also the setup about how your work about individual biases and collective decision making, how much it's under influenced by network structure and culture, right? And I just want to ask the question that in terms of how do you think AI, especially agents, as the embodiment, could become another example of social media, as the moment you just mentioned, right? Started with something with good intention. We want to bridge social networks, social capitals, end up becoming something like, social media we think of today as also a bridge for, I guess, terrorist groups and all that, right? So how much, what's exactly the mechanism that to prevent AI or agent become another case for social media?
Yeah, so I'm afraid it's going to be a continuing struggle. There's no magic bullet. To me, the core thing is to protect human agency at each step and to expand human context awareness at each step so that you're aware of more things. The things that I find most objectionable about, so for instance, social media, are these influencers or disproportionately large loud voices. Those, according to this model of decision making, completely break the ability to make good decisions. I mean, mathematically, okay? And the way they do that is, of course, as people have noted, is it crowds out all the other possibilities, okay? It also interacts with identity mechanisms and other things. So hopefully we will be able to design AI things that don't do some of those bad things by being much more dedicated towards contextual awareness, towards reflective thinking by the person, not by them, by the sort of deliberation that I was showing. That may be a little bit of a bridge too far, but trying to get people to understand when they have things in common and when they don't, by focusing their conversation as opposed to, inclusively focusing their conversation as opposed to replacing their conversation. How all that works, we don't really know. The way to find out is to build things, experiment with them, and ask what happened. Okay, so we do that on some of these platforms like Prolific. Those are the things I talked about there. And you can get large demographically sampled people, but you don't get extended behavior out of those platforms. And that's one of the reasons to partner with Consumer Reports is, for something we did a couple of years ago, is help them launch something called Passport, which gave you legal control over your data when you bought something from a company. Okay, so that you could actually easily, through an API, get them to destroy your data, to give it back, whatever, okay? And the interesting thing is that we got like 2 million people to sign up the first day. Okay, okay, so that's a pretty good population to start with. It's sort of a simple population because they're all people who are fairly educated, they're trying to do the right thing, they're somewhat literate and so forth. But they would volunteer to look for negative consequences, right? And if you watched how they use things over a period of time, you would learn a lot about what are the good things to do and what are the bad things. A second sort of potential partner that we've talked to is AARP. So there's a lot of elders who are victims of scams, poor medical device, all blah, 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 right? So there's a lot of upside to doing this better, but are there downsides to actually building helpful agents? And the only way to really understand that, I mean, we can predict some of it, but we're pretty bad at that. Social media being Exhibit A, is to deploy it in a sandbox where the people have agreed to be monitored to look for unintended effects, and then to do just exactly that, and then to have this sort of data-driven regulation that comes off of what actually happens in the real world, and try to do that proactively, so it's not a question of the whole society's falling apart before we figure out we better act, to try and do that as we discover that things are not behaving the way we thought. So this is also my attitude about regulation of AI, is I think that it's premature mostly to regulate AI, but I think that it ought to be very heavily audited, publicly audited, so that we know what's happening, and so that if there's a lawsuit, the discovery phase is essentially free, right? Because all that data is now public, and you can just go in and ask, okay, so you're deploying this thing. Are you hurting teenage girls, or whatever it is, right? But that ought to be something that all of the people who deploy things make publicly visible. And I mean, there's a whole, in the book, it has an argument about why you really want to do this. It has to do with international regulation. If you don't get everybody on board with the same sort of compatible regulations, it's not going to do you any good. So what is the minimum viable, accent on viable regulation that you can get internationally? And I think it has to do with liability and harms and things like that. So I think shooting for the way things that the EU is doing it is probably premature. I have an amusing story about it if you're interested. I ran a discussion in this thing called the Club de Madrid about this issue. So this is all the prime ministers and presidents in Europe, okay, along with the head regulators. And I was suggesting that strict liability and audit trails was really the right way to go. And all the prime ministers and presidents liked it, and all the regulators hated it. And the phrase I like best is that they accused me of being too Anglo-Saxon. So, yes, okay, whatever. So,
thanks for the presentation. In the presentation, you talked about how teams can be more effective, make better decisions when they share values or they have some kind of common utilities. Thinking about AI, is that, thinking about AI that maybe would be an agent for you or that you would work together to make a decision with? Is that something people are trying to build into AI agents, or should they, or what does that look like? How do you develop those commonalities that might, will they even have the same effects as it does in humans? Just, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So we were concerned about these AI agents, okay? I mean, are they going to be biased for the company that manufactures it? Obviously, they can have other sort of biases, and that's not even getting to the really bad guys who are trying to convince, like ISIS and people who are trying to convince you of other things. And we decided to have a partnership with Consumer Reports and some of my former team members who are now at Codex, and try and build things that were actually had fiduciary duty, okay, and could be monitored and didn't have some of these obvious biases. And we just sent out a little note, and we got the heads of AI production, which are C-level people, right, from every major AI company, every major payer, some of the big retailers in the world, all showed up on like a week notice for a half-day meeting to talk about what is best practice and standards in this area. Now, why are they doing that? Well, they're all deploying these things and building these things because they think this is the future, they're going to make more money, it's going to be more efficient, blah, 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 blah. And I can give you more about that. But they're all worried about the risk, right? I mean, just simple liability, but also class action liability, brand risk. I mean, there is no best practice. That leaves them vulnerable, right? There is no regulation standard for them to do. So the idea of trying to create such a thing is very attractive to them. And so to be effective, that has to be something that doesn't happen in a company. It's got to happen in a place like Stanford, perhaps in conjunction with people like Consumer Reports or Mozilla or something like that, that has a sort of public interest, not-for-profit flavor to it. And so that's what we're doing. And we hope to, have some initial versions in very narrow domains where you can have a hope of understanding what those phrases mean, because it's not clear what it means in the broad case. But by building things that are plausibly fiduciary representatives, agents of you in consumer purchases, small consumer purchases, and then asking what went wrong, you can begin to learn how to do that in broader domains. That's the idea. We'll see how it all goes, right? But we just don't know enough to do that more broadly. Right?
So here we've got lots of questions online. Right. I think that many of those questions are very similar to what we asked here is who fundamentally benefit from those social individual AI agents and who might be harmed significantly more. When we think about each layer of digitalization from online banking to, I think that also the digital records of hospitals. Sometimes it really make some groups more benefit more, but always left many groups behind. For this AI agents idea, so there's people in EU, maybe they cannot have agents because there's lots of access to personal data, and they also have lots of places they don't have internet, or the groups, for example, ARP, all those people, they're maybe harder for them to adapt. So how can we think about the benefits, risks, and harms for those new layer of digitalization?
Well, the top level is we need to learn how to think about that. Yeah. We don't know how to think about that, okay? That's the first thing. How do you learn how to do that? Well, you start in places where you think you have a pretty good handle on it, and you see if you really do understand it there. Yeah. And that of necessity is a sandbox, so it's not representative of everybody, it's not representative of all the decisions, but it lets you get a feeling for where you can stand, and then you expand from there. Now, personally, I have a number of things which I prefer not to put front. So, for instance, you know, when I helped put together, well, I was sort of an observer for the Millennium Development Goals, and everyone was saying, well, but half the people in the world have never made a phone call, right? So that was the year 2000. Okay, and so now 80% of all adults have a digital phone. Okay, well, that was like, oh my God, the world changed in a generation. Really changed, right? So that type of thing I think will continue to happen. There'll be more and more people hooked up. They'll have tools, the hardware will get better. You just let that go. So some of those access and equality things will get better, just sort of on their own. But that doesn't mean that the people in these different countries will have access to that, right? And so personally, I work, for instance, with a number of initiatives that are pretty successful. Like, for instance, how many people here, well, let me ask it a different way. What is the largest digital identity program in the world? And you can count that in terms of number of countries or number of people. Works the same. Anybody guess? So it's something called MOSIP, which was developed by an NGO in India. It's a digital public goods. It's free. Signed up by 26 countries. I think it's on the order of 1.4, 1.5 billion people have digital identities so that they can bank and make digital contracts and so forth. If you haven't heard of it, that's sort of appalling to me because, you know, this is the way the world, this is the way most people in the world are going, right? We're all sort of like focused on America, maybe Europe. The rest of the world is doing their own thing, and we better pay attention to that, okay? The only way I think to really answer that question, though, is to say we don't understand. We're going to start here where we sort of think we understand, and we're going to expand, and we're going to pay attention to the special needs of these different groups, including the vast majority of the world that is not us. Right?
Love it. This is great. So, Sandy, this will be my last question, but I want to ask, I read the new book, Shared Wisdom. I love all of them, but I want to get a take from you. Which is your favorite chapter and why?
The favorite chapters for different people. So there's a chapter about we've been here before, all the waves of AI and all the mistakes we've made with previous AI. There's a chapter about the digital deliberation, which I think is really pretty interesting. I actually am most interested in the chapter on bureaucracies, right? Because, you know, we talk about democracy, that makes rules, but that doesn't mean things happen, because we have these bureaucracies that were invented in the 1800s, modeled after the army, incidentally, right? And it's like, this is who we want to actually run the world? We ought to think about what a better way to do that. And I think there's some interesting examples. One of the ways I'm most excited about as an example is the Uniform Law Commission. Probably to most of you know that? So 10% of all the law in the United States is decided is proposed and shaped by this thing called the Uniform Law Commission. It's been in business since, I think, 1880 here in the United States. It's why you can buy things in other states, and why if you adopt a child, you can move to another state and it's still legal. And it's all the sort of agreements between the states to interoperate. You should look it up. It's not a hierarchical organization. It's a bottom-up grassroots thing, right? And what they do is a bunch of you folks, lawyer types, get together, say, we have this whole problem. I'll take an example. You know, if you adopt a kid in this state, it's not legal in this other state. We've got to have like a uniform law about this on a state-by-state basis. And so they put together, as volunteers, they put together model law, take it back to their states, and eventually the states get around to passing it. And that's where a good fraction of our law comes from. It's this sort of state-by-state discussion, deliberation, to come up with things that work for everybody. And I'm really amazed by the fact that it's adapted to, you know, modern banking, digital finance, I mean, you name it. It's still ticking along after, you know, 130 years, 140 years. That's a pretty good record, right? Why can't we have more things like that, right?
Why?
Oh, because the reason is that we are conditioned to think about hierarchical organizations. It's in our face as the right way to do it. And, you know, you can sort of say, well, who's interested in putting that in our brains? Well, universities like to train people who are going to be leaders, right? That's saying, oh, the world has to be hierarchical. Well, maybe not, right? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things in our culture that prohibit distributed and encourage centralized, and I think we need to re-examine those.
That's amazing. I think we should definitely bring you back again, because I want to hear more about the structures, communities, and hierarchical, even how we train our next generations. So thanks so much, Sandy.
Pleasure,
really,
yeah.
that's such a great time.
Hope you folks
Thank
enjoy
you so
it.
much. Yeah.
Again, I see copies of the book there, so you could take
Yeah,
some.
Sure. So next week we'll have my dear colleagues and friend Joe Robertson, who is actually sitting here today as well. So we'll lead our discussions about how we think about mental health, adolescence, and social media. So again, thank you all for being here. I'll see you all next week. Thanks so much.